This virtual festival has been organized by Youth Celebrate Diversity, and the festival is proudly sponsored by Boeing.
So the next speaker who should be on is Cheyenne, who is part of the Coalition Against Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women. I'm not sure if she's here yet, but she'll essentially be talking about what it means to be a part of this movement and kind of give a presentation basically explaining how we can take a stand against these horrific acts.
Right, and hopefully at the end we will be able to ask her some questions relating to the organization she works with and about the missing and murdered Indigenous women movement as well.
This is a movement that I don't think is talked about a ton, but I think it's very important to. As Ruth so eloquently put it, Indigenous women are so much more disproportionately likely to be murdered or to experience some sort of violence. And I think it's very important that we as a nation work towards ending that.
Right, and with the Coalition to Stop Violence Against Native Women, they're based out here in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and they talk about teen dating violence, the missing and murdered Indigenous women, and so forth.
Hi, Cheyenne.
All
right.
Now, Miss.
Hi, y'all. Thank you so much for being patient. My name again is Cheyenne Antonio. I am Dene from Eastern Navajo Nation, and I'm the Sex Trafficking Project Coordinator for the Coalition to Stop Violence Against Native Women. And I am very honored to be here today, just knowing that young people are taking on and learning more and politically growing and knowing about this and wanting to seek more information about missing and murdered Indigenous women is just very, it means a lot in wanting to learn about this movement and ways to move forward. I did share my presentation. Let's see. And so about MMIW, the way, that we've tried our best in assisting families. This issue has been going on for centuries, and it's now, you can see it now in acknowledging it and figuring out ways to support each other through legislation, community building, just overall figuring out how to help families and demanding justice for our relatives who go missing for, unknown reasons. MMIW, in looking at this movement more in depth, it's a long-going issue. It's a long-going struggle, in looking at it through, the foundations of this country and the ongoing battle of colonization and settler colonialism. And so every day, it's an everyday battle of having, for all of us, I think we feel it even more when it comes to surviving and having to, figure out how to help our relatives who are struggling, especially those who go missing or murdered, in ways that we won't, know or understand. But what matters is, the aftermath of finding out who did it. What matters is, getting up every day, saying your prayers and being a good relative and, knowing the power of violence when it comes to, power and control. And so that's a little about my presentation. I really wish I could share it. For some reason, it's not working for me. I'm so sorry. But a little about the coalition. We're based here in Albuquerque, and so we focus on four main areas, and that's policy advocacy, training, technical assistance and support. And so when we discuss violence, we try to find ways to talk about it because, having this job and studying about violence and impacting our people every day, it does get draining. And so ways in talking about it, we look at a scholar of Patrick Wolf, and he says the violence is a structure and not an event. And so when we look at that, we were figuring out ways to talk about, the anti-Indian policies that the United States did within the 1800s. And so looking at the Indian Removal Act, the Dawes Act, and how the U.S. targeted nations all across the United States in removing them from the traditional homelands, forced removal such as the Long Walk or the Trail of Tears. This violence has always existed towards Indigenous people of the United States. And so, this is a structure, that event has happened and that event has happened and the violence has happened and it will continue to happen, if we figure out ways to acknowledge Indigenous sovereignty. And so just looking at that and forced removals from our traditional homeland and the consistent violence that exists today through, losing our sisters, to the amount of violence, or losing our people in general, to the amount of violence that we experience every day through ripping, tribal nations out from their sovereignty, because all nations should have the ability to have, healthcare systems, should be able, especially now with COVID, a lot of our communities were hit hard, and it sort of put a microscope over us and how our nations are, they don't have that trust relationship with the federal government. And so you see that even more so with COVID. And also in 2016, with the rise of Standing Rock Lakota Nation and demanding rights over their water, with the resistance of the North Dakota Access Pipeline. And so it's, the violence and the ongoing violence continues to exist. And so with that, within my presentation, I'd have a border town violence and what does that mean? So border town violence is, when I first heard it, I actually heard it from the Red Nation, which is based out and also in all across the country. I first heard that term through the murder of Cowboy and Rabbit here in Albuquerque, New Mexico, of them being brutally murdered on the side of the streets. And so, within this struggle, it's not just a cis hetero movement. It's not based on just, violence against women. It's also looking at our LGBTQ2 plus relatives who also experience very high amounts of violence, but also our Native men who also, experience violence through being targeted, our unsheltered relatives who are targeted on the streets within border towns. And so we see a lot of that within, Farmington, New Mexico. Usually border towns are geographic locations near in an Indian reservation and our community. And so if you look at a nation and also recognizing whose land you're on, and seeing how, that city may have a big impact on nations nearby. And so for an example, I'm from the eastern part of Navajo Nation, and so my border town is Cuba, New Mexico. And so, so a border town is dependent on native resources such as land, cheap labor, water, mineral resources, and economies. Oftentimes within border towns, there are disproportionate rates of violence against Native women and children and LGBTQ2+, disproportionate rates of criminal convictions, rates towards Native people when compared to non-Native people. And so, border towns provide basic needs such as employment, food, education, access to healthcare services, access to social services, and business in general. And so within this, I was really looking forward to sharing my presentation because I have a good, I got I found I wanted to share a case, one of the earlier cases of what happens to our bodies happens to our land, and sort of going back to violence as a structure and not an event. Our relatives, and just a relation to land and body violence of what happens to our lands happens to our bodies. In looking at the killers of the Flower Moon, the Osage murders, and the birth of the FBI. This book was actually written, and you can find it. Again, it's called The Killers of the Flower Moon. So what this book was about was in the 1920s, the Osage Nation were relocated, and they owned land within. They owned their homelands, and during the Dawes Act, so the Dawes Act stripped land away from nations and privatized it, and so that's how there are private owners, private allotments, and so within that, the Osage actually were sitting on oil and were paid out. Or they were one of the first wealthiest tribes in the United States in the 1920s. And so they were actually targeted and murdered and killed, and actually were one of the very first cases that the FBI was actually, that's where the FBI grew out of, is to go and look at these cases and figuring out who murdered these families, these Osage families, and what does it look like, in bringing them to justice. And so just to put it out there, this is one of the first cases, and who knows how far these cases go back, in looking at missing and murdered Indigenous people. And so it's a long time going, and it's a continued struggle of oil and crime, and knowing that some of our nations depend on oil and gas revenues, but also looking at how do we hold our how do we hold these corporations and those who commit harm, how do we hold them accountable, and what does that look like? And so in ways that I've seen, that what it looks like is the North Dakota Access Pipeline resistance that happened in 2016 to 2018. It was actually created by Native youth. The calling of Native youth actually brought Indigenous nations together, and seeing how powerful that is, and talking to our relatives and our aunties and our kids and our children, a lot has came out of this movement, and really recognizing the kinship that we all have, and using our relations to move forward. And so there's that. And within my presentation, I also mentioned the Native Americans are more likely to be killed by law enforcement than other racial or ethnic groups. And so I found the study within the CDC, so Centers of Disease Control and Prevention, and from 1999 to 2015, Native Americans were more likely to be killed by law enforcement. And with that, I think now more than ever, we are having the conversation of what is our relationship to police? And it's important to recognize, how problematic police can be when it comes to working with, survivors of victims of sex trafficking, victims of sexual violence, even just working with Native people in general, or just people of color. There's a lot of fear and uncertainty when it comes to asking police for help. One case that we do highlight at the coalition is the murder and also justice for L'Oreal Sinigini, who was murdered in the border town of Winslow, Arizona. Within the span of 8 seconds, her life was taken away from her by an officer named Austin Shipley. And so this was actually one of the first cases that I've seen, like within the Southwest, of nations stepping up. And so Navajo Nation president and actually came to Winslow and stood outside of Winslow the police department demanding justice for L'Oreal Senegeni. And so her case, her family filed a $10.5 million wrongful death lawsuit against the Winslow Police Department. However, that was denied by the Department of Justice. And so I think it's important to acknowledge how much control the U.S. has over nations when it comes to, just the justice system and prosecuting cases. Oftentimes, we can't prosecute cases within our own nations, especially when it comes to non-natives. In 2018, there was a report of missing and murdered Indigenous women's research and database that was created by the Urban Indian Health Institute. And within that, the city sought to obtain data and tracking and responding to missing and murdered Indigenous women. Murder is the third lead cause of death among American Indian and Alaska Natives. In 2016, 5,712 cases were reported, and only 116 of them were logged into the Department of Justice database. And so if you go onto our website at csvanw.org, we actually have this study from Urban Indian Health Institute under our MMIW tab. And so within that study, they found that New Mexico is one of the top 10 of the highest number cases of MMIWG cases. So there's New Mexico following 78 cases, Washington following 71, and then Arizona at 54. And so there's like 10 states on there that focus on MMIWG and looking for cases with the highest amounts. And so within that study, they did geographically locate where these cases are. And so, yes, within that study, they locate these cases within Farmington, Santa Fe, and Albuquerque. And it's just, it's good to see like a visual part of how many cases there are, but also putting a name to the mapping.
Thank you so much, Cheyenne. We really appreciate this really, really in-depth presentation you gave us, especially with all the technical difficulties. We really appreciate that you worked through that. We are out of time, unfortunately, but we really appreciate your time. And so where can people go to find information on this coalition, on this organization?
Yeah, we are at csvanw.org. And then we are also on all forms of social media.
All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
All right. Bye.